Thank you for inviting me here to speak tonight. I'm a medical doctor. I work as a GP and I'm currently working in the Blue Mountains. And the reason I'm here is because I am a member of Doctors for the Environment Australia, which is a not-for-profit organisation of medical doctors and medical students supported by a scientific committee which includes Australians of the Year, Nobel Prize winner Professor Doherty, Professor Fiona Stanley from WA, many other eminent scientists. And the reason the Doctors for the Environment exists is to educate the community and do research and draw correlations between the damage to the natural environment and the damage to health, which are very interlinked. So I'll try and, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is the health risks of air pollution. So the key messages that I want to get across are that Australians are already suffering from adverse health effects from the current levels of air pollution. Also that there is no safe limit for particle pollution in Australia or around the world. And also that pollution, you don't need to see it for it to be harmful to the health. And in fact, it's the pollution that you can't see that is the most dangerous. Also that there are some particular populations that are most at risk. Those include children, the elderly and those with chronic diseases already. And the current regulations aren't protecting public health sufficiently. So not everyone will know this fact, but actually air pollution contributes to almost double the national road toll in mortality each year. And if we break this down to just fine particle pollution, which is, I'll tell you about the different components of air pollution shortly, but just fine particle pollution alone in the major cities causes over 1,500 deaths. The health costs of air pollution are something in the range of $8.4 billion a year. So that's a substantial saving if we're thinking about wanting to save money on health. We could improve people's health and save money at the same time. And just in the Sydney area, the health costs of just particle pollution, which is only one fraction of pollution, although the most important for health concerns, it's around $4.7 billion a year. So very significant numbers, and not something we necessarily know. It's not on the front page of the news very often. Maybe it should be a bit more. The current levels of air pollution are roughly equivalent to smoking 1 cigarette a day, and that's obviously not just adults, that's children, that's unborn babies. We don't have a choice about breathing, basically, so we breathe whatever air that we're near. In Sydney, the air pollution, so some of the pollutants are showing an improvement, and that's for a number of different reasons. So they're things like carbon dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, and sulfur dioxide. However, some pollutants are actually, they're not improving and they're projected to increase in the future. And those are the most concerning aspects for health. That's particle pollution, which is sort of, that accounts for most of the health concerns with air pollution. And also ozone, which is, ozone is formed when other kind of air pollutants like nitrogen dioxide interact with heat on the ground level and create ozone, which irritates the airways. So just to outline sort of how people are dying of air pollution, sorry, it's a little bit grim. So most of the deaths from air pollution are ischemic heart disease, which is heart attack. Lung cancer is a significant proportion, 17%, stroke, 22%, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is chronic lung disease. It's chronic bronchitis and emphysema, the same kind of illnesses that you get from smoking. And also, just to highlight as well that, we know the numbers for the increased deaths associated with air pollution, but for every increased death, there's a whole clinical iceberg effect. So you've got increase in hospital admissions, you've got increased visits to the doctor, to the emergency room, medications that you might not have otherwise needed, you've got symptoms, quality of life, so there's a whole lot of effects that people are suffering from that could potentially be avoided if we were to further clean up our air. So I'm just going to go through a few of the main air pollutants and the effects on health. Oxides of nitrogen So that has effects on health for from both the short term and the long term. So short-term exposures can lead to increased risks of asthma, respiratory symptoms, so that's going to the emergency department because you have trouble breathing, and also even short-term exposure can increase the cardiovascular, so the heart and the lung death rate. Long-term exposure, we know that high levels of oxides of nitrogen, they impair lung growth in children, and they are associated with cough and wheeze and sort of asthma-type symptoms in children as well. And currently about almost over 60% of nitrogen dioxide pollutants in around Sydney are due to motor vehicles. Ground level ozone, so that's, as I said, that's a mix when there's things like oxides of nitrogen react with heat and sunlight, and they form a substance called ground level ozone, which is a very potent respiratory irritant. So it irritates the lungs, and this effect can happen even in people with otherwise completely healthy lungs. So it's not just an effect on people who are already unwell. We know that increased ground level ozone affects increase in death rates, increase in hospital admissions, increases emergency department attendances, and vulnerable groups. I mean, although everyone can be affected, most vulnerable, again, we see are children, the elderly, and those obviously exposed to high levels as well. Particulate matter I want to spend a little bit more time on because that's the most important with regards to health. And just to give you an idea of the size of the particles we're talking about, this picture shows that there's a fine beach sand, that's a little round thing there, and coarse particles, 10 microns or less. You can fit 5 of them in the width of a human hair. So they're the coarse ones. The fine ones, 2.5 microns or less, around about 40 times you can fit about 40 of them in the size of human hair. And ultrafine is again sort of submicron, so very, very tiny. And what we know is that the smaller the particles, the deeper when you breathe in, they breathe deep into your lungs, and they can actually cross into the bloodstream and go to different parts of the body. So the coarse particles are not so much of a problem because they get filtered out by the top of your airway. You cough it up, but the fine particles breathe deep into your lungs, get into your bloodstream, and they're the ones that are really causing the increase in heart and lung diseases, and as well as neurological things like stroke. So sources of particle pollution in Australia varies. There's a lot of different sources. Motor vehicle emissions is one of them. Also fossil fuel combustion, so that might be coal-fired power stations, mining, and there's also natural sources of particle pollution as well. And motor vehicles account for around 14 to 17%. So PM, I think you saw on the previous slide, PM10 refers to those coarse particles. PM2.5 is the much finer particles, and the ultrafine is a step below that. So particulate matter there's such a wealth of research around particulate matter and the health effects that it's actually been classified as a Group 1 carcinogen, and that puts it in the same happy camp as things like asbestos, tobacco, smoke, diesel exhaust and benzene. So not the sort of thing that you'd like to be breathing on a regular basis. In general, the health effects of particulate matter, again we see an increase in asthma attacks, impairs lung development in children, so reduces the amount of lung tissue that the child grows into, so ultimately affects them throughout their lifespan. Increased risk of heart problems such as heart attacks, where the heart goes out of rhythm, arrhythmias, and atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the blood vessels, stroke, lung cancer, and chronic lung disease. And there's also some emerging evidence about the impact on the fetus when the mother is exposed to high levels of these pollutions, this particle pollution, such as premature birth or low birth weight in babies. And the really important thing to note about particle pollution as well is that there isn't a safe limit. So something I'll touch on later is we have these standards in place, the national standards, but they're not standards at which the health effects happen above the standard and there's no health effects below the standard. It's basically like a sliding scale. So the lower you can get the particle pollution, the more health benefits you can get. And so even having, I mean, Australia by and large has sort of, it mostly sits within the standards that it's imposed on itself, with some exceedances. But even with that level, we're still seeing people dying from air pollution. So there's no safe limit to these kinds of particles. Just some more detail on the short-term effects. So this is short-term as in one day or a couple of days of high exposure to these particles. There's an increased risk of heart issues, again, heart attacks, sort of funny heart rhythms called arrhythmias, asthma attacks, and also other respiratory symptoms like cough and breathlessness and wheeze, and reduced lung function in children. The long-term risks of health effects of these very small particles, again, increased risk of lung cancer, increased risk of heart and lung death, and increased risk of death from all different causes. So the vulnerable groups, I've mentioned them already, but importantly, this is where sort of the justice element comes into it, because a lot of these groups are people who don't have they're not able to kind of move to a different area that has less pollution. They're people like children and unborn children, people who are already unwell, and those who have the misfortune to live next to high pollution intensity infrastructure like coal-fired power stations or like very busy roads. This is just a little bit more about air pollution just in affecting children. So we know that it aggravates asthma, we know that it increases cough and bronchitis, we know that it increases the chance of going to emergency for these kinds of things, it increases hospital admissions, and it, again, as I said earlier, it decreases the lung development of children, which has lifelong effects. And there's some emerging evidence, again, with the effects of air pollution on unborn babies, so low birth weight babies, and also high risk of allergy, which we're sort of seeing a blossoming of allergy and allergic diseases in the community. So the national standards, as I said earlier, we need national standards. It's great that we have them, but unfortunately they don't represent a safe level. So just because a project complies with a national standard doesn't mean that it's protecting the population from the health effects of air pollution. And also there was a recent review into the standards of particle pollution, and there were a range of different kind of options that were presented. And unfortunately we kind of ended up with sort of the higher level of options in most of the different categories. And the actual review, the National Environmental Protection Measure body itself, which is a kind of review body, and they're responsible for setting the standards. They said themselves that there is an ongoing risk that Australian public health will not be sufficiently protected. Try and put this into context a little bit along the WestConnex route, and we know this is drawing from work air pollution researchers from the Environmental Justice Australia wrote in their submission. We know that particle pollution along many areas of the WestConnex route is already close to current standards. It's already having an effect on health, basically. And there's very large residential areas that are experiencing health levels at that kind of upper limit of what we consider safe, even though there is actually no safe limit. And that the projections into the future that is actually in the EIS itself, so the WestConnex proponents have put this forward, that they project into the future that these key kind of monitoring sites, the maximum concentration is below, but very close to the levels. And we know from a health point of view, that's not really good enough to protect public health. That's basically saying we're accepting a death rate of around about 3,000 people per year. Air pollution in tunnels is something that people are concerned about, obviously, as well. And that's a little bit more difficult to comment on from a health point of view because they're very short exposures. but their exposures to very, very high concentrations of air pollutants, such as like in the hundreds, when the kind of limit is sort of 50 or below. And the NHMRC put out a review a couple of years ago and they basically said that they're concerned that emissions can cause short-term health impacts for tunnel users in busy traffic, and they may also cause health effects in residential neighbourhoods around tunnels. There's a lot of sort of modelling differences, and it's very hard to kind of comment and without knowing the sort of specific details of each different tunnel or ventilation stack.
You will have heard Peter's justification for not having sort of stacks along the route, that there would be enough ventilation in a tunnel, as I understand it, at the start of it and the end of it, where the openings are, and according to the gradation of the entry in and out of the tunnel, that's going to be enough to somehow or other ensure that there's no pollution in the tunnel. Do you agree with that?
I'm going to be a little bit annoying and say that I probably don't know enough information to properly comment, but what we know about tunnels basically is that they're basically like roads, so we know that there's an increased level of pollution, and the pollution has to come out somewhere, basically holes in the ground. So it either comes out of the pollution stacks, or it comes out of the places where the cars go in and out, or it doesn't come out, in which case the pollution in the tunnel gets very high. So either way, I mean, basically you still have the impact, the kind of air pollution associated with a busy road, and whether it is concentrated in the tunnel or whether it sort of gets out somehow, it's still adding to the cumulative pollution.
Right.
That's how I understand it.
Yeah, right. And what about that thing that, the scrubbing of the air, the actual, which I understand to be some kind of purifying of the air so that it can actually let out over the suburbs where we all live. Does that work? Is that an effective technique?
Well, again, I probably don't have the expertise to answer it totally. From what I've read about the air ventilation stacks, the New South Wales government report said that they didn't think that they needed the sort of purification or the filtration.
Which is what they said about M5.
Yeah.
Which is
not the case. And that sort of leads me on to another point that I wanted to make about the way that we measure air pollution as well, which at the moment it's not really targeting the vulnerable communities or the hotspots. It's measured in these kind of population representative ways. So the Australian Medical Association, for example, is recommended that we need to change the way that we're monitoring to actually target the vulnerable population. So it's possible that the modelling that has been done hasn't been, we're not sort of getting accurate data.
Right.
But again, I'm unfortunately not a tunnel expert, so I probably have my knowledge stops it out there.
No, fair enough. And look, I'm sorry to interrupt, and if you think that, do you need to continue to the end of the presentation, or could we cut it short? I'll just tell you because Michelle Zybots is also due to have a chat to us this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sure. She's a transport planner, and she's got some very interesting things to say as well. Yeah. So, I'm sorry.
I might just finish because it finishes on a very slightly more positive note, which is nice.
I love the sound of that.
And it just shows you that actually there are really significant health effects if we increase tighten our standards and we lower our air pollution. So in the US, for example, which is a more polluted country in general than Australia, more industry, more people, they saved approximately $5.9 billion just from tightening the standard 3 micrograms per metre squared. So that's pretty significant. That's just health costs. There was also a natural experiment that happened in the Atlanta Olympic Games where they banned car travel for the duration of the Games in this certain area, and they found that ozone levels decreased by a third, and then asthma presentations fell, and then afterwards when people got back in the cars and started driving, the asthma presentations went back up again. So we have these kind of natural experiments to show that actually reducing sources of pollution really does benefit health. This is a bit of a quote from the government advisory body on air pollution standards, and this is basically just saying that the lower we have the standard, there's actually real significant differences. So if you have the lowest standard possible, you get a 60% decrease in cardiovascular hospital admissions, childhood asthma and emergency attendances. And also children's lungs get to grow better. So
and I also understand that the emissions from the stacks is less than 2.5 microns, which actually is very difficult to measure. So with the unfiltered stacks and the increased traffic on our roads, what are the consequences for us in relation to those increased statistics that are going to happen as a result of WestConnex when it's complete?
yeah, so it's an interesting point you make about the very, very fine particles, because they are more difficult to measure, and they're also an area that hasn't had as much research, but people who are very, very concerned about them, basically. So it's an area, we know they're emitted from motor vehicles, but we don't really know quite how dangerous they are. So that's an important point. I guess the risks to the population who are in that if you are exposed to a high level of pollution, especially particle pollution, it does have a population-wide health risk. So all those risks that I was talking about, the asthma, cardiovascular disease, increase in stroke, if it's found that these increased cars on the road leads to increased particle pollution, which makes a lot of sense because we know that that's a significant cause of particle pollution. And especially the other kinds of pollution as well. We know that that's going to have a health impact on our community. And whether, I guess, it's hard to tell where that impact will occur, but that really depends on where the sort of pollution hotspots end up being, whether they're around the stacks, or whether they're around the entries, or whether they're sort of next to the freeway. It's difficult to tell without sort of all that really detailed modelling. But we know, in general, more cars on the road leads to more air pollution, which leads to health